William Marshall moved away from Castle Gordon in 1790. Why? Well, the reason is not really known. Perhaps he wanted a certain level of independence. He'd been working as a servant of the Duke since the age of 12. It might have had something to do with an incident, an unfortunate incident that happened the year before, 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Marshall was in London carrying out a commission for the Duke. He had to pay a bill for £100, 17 and 11, a very large sum. And walking through the streets of London, he had the misfortune to have his pocket picked. He had to report back to the Duke the money had all gone. The Duke would be displeased, naturally enough, though he would realise that Marshall was not in any way to blame, except maybe he had been a little bit careless, I don't know. But anyway, the Duke restored most of the bill from castle funds, £70 of it, and he required Marshall to pay the balance, £10, 17 and 11. Must have been mortifying for Marshall, such a principled servant as the Duke, to, if you like, as he would see it, fail him in that way. And maybe that distanced him from the Duke a little bit, and maybe he felt it was time to move on. It's an interesting story anyway. He went to Burnside of Tynet, a farm, and he stayed there for 2 years working quite skillfully and effectively as a farmer. And this is the real Burnside of Tynet, which he wrote at the time. Burnside of Tynet. The 2 years came to an end when the Duke asked Marshall to become the farmer at Keithmore in Glenfiddich. Keithmore was a big farm, and it wasn't the easiest one to manage. It was in uncompromising land, very exposed, where the winds blew and the rains fell in the bad weather that does occasionally happen in Scotland. And so it wasn't a great place to go to, but over the years Marshall became very fond of it. He was still a lively and healthy man, strong man too, and he was quite happy to work as the farm manager there. The more happy when 2 years later the Duke offered him the demanding but interesting job of being factor for his lands in Banffshire and Aberdeenshire. Now these were extensive lands, from the lands of the Cabrach and Glenrinnes and the lordship of Achendoon, Strathaven and Glenlivet. And for that work, Marshall was offered and accepted £50 per annum. So with the farm revenue and that £50 and the money he'd earned over many years, he was quite comfortably off by then. He would ride on horseback across the extensive lands. He would meet the tenants, he would listen to their concerns, he would gather in the rents, he would report back to the Duke how things were going. And he was lucky, in a sense, because he did not have to deal with any clearances. Now further north, the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, with their notorious factor Patrick Seller, they very much dealt in clearances, and there was much misery as a result. But Marshall didn't have to do this simply because the Duke did not require it. Whether the Duke didn't believe in clearing his tenants, whether he felt a moral duty to them, whether there was no commercial imperative that he did that, I don't know, but it didn't happen. So Marshall was admired and respected by the tenants, and it was a fine time in his life. When he was at Keithmore, he wrote a very fine strathspey, and I shall play it now, and it's called Keithmore. Here it is. Just before I do, let me read to you a verse from a poem which William Marshall noted in his journal. Maybe it gives an idea of the demanding nature of that countryside, with its ancient ruins and the wind whistling over the bare lands. Keithmore. Beneath the towers of Achendoon that rise in ruins on the brae, between the moorlands bare and brune, the Fiddle rushes to the spey. and doon by grim Balvenny's keep, the Athol Stewart's mountain dell, where climbing copses clothe the keep, and birk and hazel fringe the glen. We might have found a better rhyme in the last line, but it gives you an idea of what the land was like. Oh, and one other thing. Marshall continued with his scientific explorations and his practical work while he was at Keithmore, and I'm going to read you a little bit about a thing he did. Marshall had learned the art of dialing at Gordon Castle. We know that. From an Italian called Rani, we know that too. He laid down a meridian line, and thus his house was built at a certain angle to the sun, allowing him to tell the time of day. The sun's rays would stream through an aperture in his closed window shutters. Consequently, this beam of light would land at a certain place on his writing desk, and he then could deduce the time of day by referring to an almanac. Clever man. Well, I mentioned a Strathspey, Keithmore, and here it is. 33 years, that's a long time. And he was now, towards the end of that time, definitely middle-aged, in fact, elderly. He decided to move again, and he moved to a farm called Dandalith. And he may have been influenced in this by his family, perhaps particularly by his daughter. Now, I have said very little, if anything, about his daughter up till now. Her name was Jean, named after her mother, who was Jean Giles. She married James McInnes, who ran a building concern and who worked for Thomas Telford, the bridge designer, in the building of Craigellachie Bridge. So McInnes was a well-established man. Marshall wrote some tunes for her, and I'll play one in just a moment, but it may well be that as her father grew older, she suggested to him, time to move. This is not a very hospitable land. Let's go somewhere else. And they went to Dandalith, and also he was persuaded to build a new cottage there, which is called Newfield Cottage, because the Dandalith farmhouse was ramshackle, draughty, and fairly unpleasant. I'm going to play one of the tunes that he wrote for his daughter. This is Mrs. James McInnes' Strathspey. Here we go. I hope you didn't notice, but you'll know about it now, one way or another. Anyway, there he was, about to leave Keithmore. Sadly, because many things had happened there. One of the saddest was the death of his oldest son, Archibald, back from India in a poor physical condition, suffering from disease, and he died in 1807 in the house at Keithmore. But there are many good things as well. For example, the birth of grandchildren to his daughter. Very good. Anyway, one more tune. Now this tune is a particularly famous one, and it's called very appropriately just The Farewell. The Farewell was to Keithmore after all these years. William Marshall wrote it just before he left. Now this tune is played by many traditional Scots fiddlers nowadays, and I have a wonderful recording by Natalie McMaster. You may have heard of her. She's a Cape Breton fiddler, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And of course what happened was that the clearance people crossed the Atlantic and they went to New Scotland, Nova Scotia, and they took their music with them. And among other tunes, they took the tunes of William Marshall, so that now one of the worldwide stars of folk fiddle music, Natalie McMaster, with her even more extraordinary husband, Donald Leahy, and her 7 highly musical children. She plays this tune, and she plays it really well. Farewell then to Keithmore.